there. I hope you're doing well. Today is a kind of cool day. It looks like it rained a little bit over the night, so it's it's starting to turn into fall here in Portland. Today I'm drinking a decaf coffee by Onyx. It's one I've drank off and on for a while. It's such a good, nice, warm hug of a coffee. So today we're going to talk about two books. Surprise, surprise. The first one is How Progress Ends by Carl Benedict Frey, published in September of 2025. And the second one is The Internet Con by Cory Doctorow, which was published in September of 2024. I decided to position these two books against each other because the premises of them somewhat clash and reinforce each other. The reinforcement generally comes from like where we end up with How Progress Ends, but there's definitely some difference of opinions throughout the books. So I would argue that How Progress Ends is an economic history book, and it does a full sweep of history, starting at during the early Chinese dynasties and including the Song and Ming and Qing dynasties, and the whole way up through like the 1200s. So it's a pretty long survey of history, and it looks at the different changes of government within China and then between Japan and Europe and the United States, and in different time periods within Chinese history. So it compares the Song dynasty with the Ming dynasty and talks about the differences in the bureaucracy and what that led to in terms of the innovation of that country. I do want to note that I found it somewhat annoying that Frey continually called China the Middle Kingdom. He referred to critical events by their historically important name, like the Meiji Restoration in Japan, the Glorious Revolution in England under Cromwell, but Middle Kingdom is the one that he referred to the most by a different name. Not exactly sure why he did this. It was certainly a choice. He also did this with something else beyond what I mentioned, but that one didn't really stick out as much. But he certainly did have these little nicknames he called certain things. Economic history, there's kind of two broad camps. There's camps that look at, and this is a little reductive. I know that there's more than this, but in terms of innovation theory or what drives an economy forward, there's Joel Mokier's lever of riches camp, which is like the innovation drives everything forward. And then you have kind of the shock of the old from David Edgerton camp that kind of argues that innovation doesn't always drive everything about the economy. And I think you see that with Blood in the Machine. I know this Netherlands history book here talks about the Dutch innovations and revolutions, industrial revolutions, which were very different than the industrial revolution in Britain. What the shock of the old kind of argues is that things that are no longer at the forefront have a shockingly long, it's the name, tail in terms of impact. The easiest way to describe this is the Nazis during World War II had more horses for supply chain management than any other war in history. And yeah, sure, there was Panzer tanks, but they needed to use horses for supply chain. And in Russia during the cold winter, because vehicles couldn't start during it, but horses could certainly walk, that's how they got materials moving around, delivering to men. And so we need to be cognizant of that as we think about this, especially whenever you start thinking about the dispersion of innovation from technological sources to other areas. There's a whole theory about how you almost have to do reverse engineering on all these technologies to learn how to actually fix them. And that actually is a theme within Frey's book, where he talks about how Britain outlawed shipping machines to other countries outlawed importing them, and Britain also banned experts from going, like, emigrating out of Britain to other countries. But they did a really bad job of this, so major machines like the cotton gin very quickly left, or the steam engine very quickly left Britain and went to other parts of Europe. And experts followed it, and that helped build those local economies, and then they were able to build their own local machines. I think that Frey is clearly in the milkier camp, where he really focuses on levers of riches. He actually has milkier as his first epigraph in the book, and he references lever of riches throughout the book. So, and he also specifically calls out the UK Parliament for being brave in the face of the Luddite revolt and continuing to push forward with supporting the Arkwright watermill and these factories in the Midlands, and intentionally forcing to break the power of the guilds. He thought that Parliament was brave. But Frey really glosses over a lot of the horrors of the Industrial Revolution. These horrors are not new. Granted, considering when the books were published, Frey's book was probably already in the publishing pipeline whenever Blood in the Machine came out. But none of those sources were particularly new in that. So if we kind of think about Blood in the Machine in the context of this, there's all the things that are covered in Blood in the Machine are kind of glossed over. The child labor, the atrocious safety standards in the factories, the drop in equality during the time period, kids being pulled out of orphanages and killed in the factories by the machines. And I found this kind of frustrating because he doesn't talk about the inequality. He just talks about, oh, it was brave to break the power of the guilds and these family manufacturing systems. And towards the end of the book, Frey calls out this economic metric called the Gini coefficient. And this measures roughly the inequality in an economy. The closer to 1 it is, the more unequal it is, the higher inequality. The closer to 0 it is, the more equal they are. And historians have gone through and back calculated this metric for a variety of economic time periods. And I remember during my studies in Eindhoven, we talked about the Gini coefficient during the Industrial Revolution and how it went up. And Frey could have talked about this during this time period, but he chose not to. And I think that was an intentional decision because he's talking about how progress ends now, where the Gini coefficient is somewhat concerning because our inequity is continuing to rise. But he didn't talk about it during the Industrial Revolution because he deals with it in a different way, where yes, inequality goes up, but the way that is dealt with in Europe is that people flee England and they go to all these other countries and they're able to have high mobility. Only a certain class of people can have that mobility, and it's specifically the leaders. And he argues that it goes from a very bureaucratic, centralized type area to exploit the benefits to decentralized that allows new innovation to follow. And right now, we're at the point that you can see similarities where U.S. government and the UK Parliament are supporting the concentration of technology and exploitation and the Trump administration is trying to prevent immigrants from coming in and people from leaving. Britain tried to do the same thing. The U.S. has always had a more decentralized economy than the UK and most of Europe, but right now it's very centralized in terms of where the money is going. VC funding is all going towards Silicon Valley. So the main goal of how progress ends is to categorize periods of economic innovation and economic stagnation and look at the structures of government and industry and supporting structures like academia, and look at how things became diversified or and concentrated, how certain bureaucratic environments allowed for innovation and rapid dissemination of information and growth, and then how that eventually stagnates as the point of the governments become just more government. And that's where Frey kind of talks about with the Ming and Qing dynasty in China, where all the best and the brightest start going towards becoming bureaucratic members of the Chinese empire, and that leads to stagnation because nobody's going into the arts and sciences. There's great exploration during the Song dynasty because there's a lot of decentralization of it, and then it gets pulled more and more centralized. And even the great innovations that happened during the Song dynasty are left to rot and are destroyed during the later dynasties. And Frey kind of finishes his book with significant concerns about where our progress is sitting in the United States, where we have massive organizations like the Magnificent Seven, Google, Facebook, Amazon, OpenAI, NVIDIA, etc. These are deeply entrenched, and we have government allowing them to continue to exploit this. And you can see consolidation is kind of the goal right now with the Trump administration, where Oracle, who's already one of those big tech companies that has a huge sway, huge amount of power, they're buying TikTok with some support of VC. That's another concentration. That is adding another one of these data mining companies where they have a social media entity attached to them. You have, all the Tesla companies with X, AI, and Twitter and all that kind of together. You have Microsoft and LinkedIn, and you have Meta and all the Facebook stuff, and Reddit is, they've stolen all the data from Reddit and from Facebook and across all these companies, and so they all have they're all trying to exploit the data right now, and they need to be bigger. They need scale. You hear about all these deals that are happening where OpenAI is going to invest $300 billion into Oracle, and then Oracle is going to invest $300 billion into OpenAI, and then OpenAI is going to buy $300 billion worth of NVIDIA parts. And it's just here's this example. I mean, look at this the way that the money is going throughout. And I think I referenced this a little bit in another video, but this is terrible. Everything is feeding into each other. It is a pyramid scheme, Ponzi scheme. It is a snake eating its own tail. It's going to collapse. And instead of the U.S. government really encouraging antitrust and breaking up these massive organizations, we have a government that is really encouraged by people like Peter Thiel, who helped fund JD Vance's rise, our current VP, and who says that competition is for losers. His whole thing is that monopolies are good. And since the 1980s, when Robert Bork presented this new standard for antitrust, that it has to have consumer harm, and you had to prove consumer harm. That has made it very hard to break up companies. And so that means that you end up with monopolies, you end up with less competition, and you end up with harm in these massive companies. In my opinion, this is where Frey's book kind of fizzles out. I think he really dropped the ball on the recommendations. He doesn't have a great number of recommendations on what to do. He's kind of is like, I don't know what to do. And I think part of that's because he is part of the Chicago School of Economics theory base, where monopolies are good, actually, and that these you need to be able to exploit. And he's mentioned that antitrust has done good things in the past because it led to decentralization. He doesn't really want to recommend policies that do that, though, because that kind of goes against his actual economic beliefs in a lot of ways. And I think that the right thing would be to break up these companies. It would be to break up VCs. It would be to break up private equity. It'd be to break up Amazon, Google, Microsoft. He doesn't really think that AI is the next big thing. He thinks it's going to fail, which we're in a bubble. We're clearly in a bubble. I mean, and if you want to read anything about that, Ed Zitron put out a good piece again this past week about that. But he doesn't think that's going to be the next thing to revolutionize things, even though that's where all this growth is coming from. He completely ignores the blockchain, which is kind of funny, but he kind of doesn't really think that that's the next thing. His recommendations overall are really meek, and I think that's where you have to look beyond someone like Frey into a critic of big tech. And that's where the Internet Con comes into place. And I really felt that Cory Doctorow's book, The Internet Con, is relatively straightforward to read. It's not overly in the weeds from a technology standpoint. He explains the technical details of pertinent things very well, specifically interoperability, which is the main thrust that he's arguing that we should use to break tech's power. In a lot of ways, we saw with the shutting down of APIs that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars from Reddit, where companies used to have products built on top of them that suddenly were shut down. TweetDeck was an example. It was bought by Twitter, but that was sitting on top of Twitter's API, so you could get a different user experience. Now those all cost an exorbitant amount of money because those companies now see the value in hoarding the data so they can use it to fund their own ad revenue and exploiting it for AI and all those sorts of things. And the value of interoperability for you and me is that I can join Facebook, but I don't actually have to go on Facebook. And I can have access to all the networks of friends. I'm not on Facebook right now. I'm on WhatsApp and Instagram and Threads. I'm not really active in any of those anymore, but I have accounts on them. Facebook, I don't have an account anymore. But Facebook certainly has a shadow account for me in Facebook. But what would be ideal is if instead of having to kill my account so that Facebook wouldn't have my data anymore, I could have taken all that data somewhere else and still had access to my network on there, still been able to post into Facebook, but not have them know everything about another part of my network. And I think that that's an important thing. And I'll get back on Threads in a minute. And Doctorow points out that all of this is feasible. Any cloud computer or any data center is just another computer. All computers are interoperable. They're designed to be interoperable. A program that runs on one computer can run on another computer. You might have difficulty. You might have to run some software to enable that. But that's kind of the point. They're universal machines. And you can have any program talk to another program. Now, that generally is not always easy to do, or you have to figure out how to communicate with APIs. There's an entire industry of companies that are all about data integration for other companies. So like you can have, let's say you have like Oracle for your data warehousing, and you have an ERP from SAP, and then you have QuickBooks, and you have, just your manufacturing system. You can pull all those together through communicating directly to their databases or through APIs that make it easier to pull data out. And you can put it into something like Tableau and you can do analysis on it. So there's benefits for large companies that where all these things you're accessible for you. And there's benefits because you can pay extra to like Oracle and SAP to use all of those businesses. But generally, that's not available for regular day-to-day consumers like you and me. And that's because of a provision in the Digital Millennial Copyright Act. It's not Section 230, which is like what everybody talks about. It's Section 1201. And it is a provision that makes it illegal for you to circumvent any security in the system. So even if there's a very minor half-assed effort to paper over SQL injections or SQL interfaces, and you figure out a way to do it, it's a felony. It is a felony. It is not a misdemeanor. It is not a small fine. It is not they should have done a better job with security. It's a felony. Now, we know from all the data breaches out there that a lot of these aren't taken very seriously because the data breach is inherently circumventing these things. But you can't build a product around a data breach. The data is stolen and sold off and sold to data brokers, where data brokers are like, I don't know where it came from. But if they were the ones who were actively stealing that data because they were breaking into Facebook, they would be shut down. And really, this is a significant shift because this isn't just about websites or small software things. It's about any piece of software. Any piece of software can put encryption, secure boot, security protection on it. My company, we do wireless audio, and we put secure boot and encryption on there, and our packets are transmitted encrypted and with our own secure algorithm. And breaking any of those and trying to read the data is inherently breaking 1201. And so like we're seeing more of this with cars where you can't go to any maintenance shop and get work done. And these are all examples. Just to be clear, most of these examples I'm talking about specifically are in Cory Doctorow's book, like the car example, the farm tractors, John Deere. He digs into John Deere pretty specifically. Farmers have always been on the cutting edge of tinkering with things to make them more optimal for them to do their job easier. And now, like, since most farms are done by massive conglomerates, to some extent I don't care that much, but there's also still regular people who buy a tractor who want to be able to fiddle with the software because they like fiddling and fixing things. But you have to wait for a John Deere technician to come out, or you violate copyright and it voids your warranty and it does all these things. And they can make things less efficient. I mean, like, look at what Tesla does. They can do a software patch and drive more performance out of your batteries. If that was open source, there could be an entire community building on that, working to drive improvements out of batteries, or providing entire packages that people could download and install that would drive optimal behavior in a city or something like that. And that's not legal. And Tesla would say, well, you can't trust those people. I'm doing this for the good of you. So it's a very paternalistic thing, which is also something Dr. O explicitly says as well. And he kind of talks about these as in terms of walled gardens, like Facebook is a walled garden, Apple App Store is a walled garden, Google for most of us is a walled garden. We don't go out and download other app stores. We could, but it's not the same way that if you are using like a phone from China right now, there's no Google stuff in it. So you have to use other app stores to be able to do anything on that. So it's much more open in that sense. And it's also why if you go into your Kindle on your Android phone and you go and try and buy a book, you can't buy it. Or bookshop.org, which is what I have been using. Trying to go to bookshop.org on the app, you can read whatever book you want, but you can't buy any books through it because 30% of that is going to go to Google or Apple, depending on whose environment you're in. But because a web browser is universal, it's a universal program, there's no difference between using your web browser on your phone and using a web browser on your computer. You can go to bookshop.org and buy the book, the exact same book, the exact same device, and it might even be the exact same program underlying it all because HTML5 allows you to take web pages and turn them into web apps, which can be turned into something you publish on the App Store, which Dr. O talks about. But so it could be literally the exact same application. And one is you could do it for free and one you can't. And this is insane, in my opinion. If you can use it, it should. Apple shouldn't be able to charge 30% like that. And especially since a lot of these companies are already operating on thin margins, it's kind of like a contempt of any business practice who uses the App Store, because Apple punishes companies that jack up the prices whenever you buy through the App Store. If it was a $10 book and you charge $13 for it, Apple's like punishes you for violating terms of service, even though that's the only way to keep your margins the same, like between selling it on the web and selling it on Apple. And for book businesses, this is a significant, it's the difference between a viable business and an unviable business. And really, I don't even think that these companies are adding much of a service. I mean, if it is payment, it is certainly 30% is outrageous compared to what credit cards offer, 2 to 4%, which is on top of it. But it's all about control and dominating these spaces, and that's what Dr. O is arguing that they're doing. And that's something that we shouldn't let be interoperable. That's why Fortnite with Epic Games, they were intentional about trying to push Apple's buttons to try and force a lawsuit, to try and prove that it was anti-competitive, it was hurting customers, it was doing this, that, and the other thing. And they got a partial victory on there, but that's something that we need to keep an eye on to see what happens with that. Dr. really argues that we should enable adversarial interoperability and that we should really change this 1201 law section. And because it allows people to get around these outrageous costs. Steam is another example where you have all sorts of really high markup for video games, but it's like the best best place for video game purchasing. But I can go and download a bunch of other stores. The problem is they suck. And so I'm voting with my money by saying that, yeah, sure, Epic, you have your own game store, but this is terrible to use. It's hard to find what I want. It's limited. So I'm going to keep using Steam. All my friends are there. But if there was an option where I could go and buy a game that was on Steam through Epic and all my friends would automatically come over and have my Epic friends and the friends on Steam, that might be a better option. That would be great. It would break some of the power there for both of these companies. Dr. O likes to call Section 1201 contemptive business model, where reverse engineering is essentially illegal. Because if you flout the business model of of Apple or Google or something like that by getting around and circumventing their stuff, you're saying their business model is flawed and that this is a better approach. And government right now is saying, no, you're not allowed to do that. You need to abide by the business model that Apple and Google have put in place, that they are securing using these security provisions. And I don't really think that's a role that government should be in, because that goes back to this centralization and stagnation where there's no competitors for this because of these rules. We get rid of this section, and then that can open things up and allow people to jailbreak things or to circumvent things. Yes, there are risks to that, and there's risks in a lot of ways with that, and we'll kind of talk about those in a second. But I think that in some ways those risks are worth it, because you can build an entire different business that is focused on trust and privacy. Apple collects a bunch of data around you and they use it for whatever. They don't let Facebook collect all that data, but Apple sure collects it. Well, what if I decided to use a different app store that I paid $5 a month to, and they didn't store any of the data about what I was using, and they didn't track it? They just enabled the transaction, and that was it. That might be a very popular app store. That's why we need this. Same with data storage. Like I'm on getting to that other idea of integration and being a federated service, which is where you have Facebook or Twitter, where you can have people stand up their own instances of that and communicate with the broader network and communicate seamlessly without any sort of issue. Mastodon is an example of an alternative to Twitter that's done like that. So is Blue Sky. I would argue that Mastodon is a bit of a design primarily for that first, whereas Blue Sky is kind of like secondary. And the goal is that you can join a specific server that says, I want this sort of behavior. So I'm on called the Radical Zone, and it focuses on leftist tech type people. And the admin goes through and manages interconnection between our server and other servers. He blocks every Nazi server that tries to communicate with anyone that spams us, all that sort of stuff, so you don't have to worry about it. He blocks harassment, and it's good for the entire server. And if I didn't like that, if I wanted to go and read some of these horrible people's thoughts, I could go to another server and make sure that I see it. That would be an intentional choice on my point. I could take my name and go there, and it could be fine. And to be clear, like Truth Social is a fork of Mastodon. It's not integrated though. Mastodon, most servers do not allow that interaction. Truth Social doesn't allow that either. Facebook Threads is another fork of Mastodon. And it doesn't, it's been promising interop between Threads and other Mastodon instances. And the other Mastodon instances are leery about that because they don't want the data from their servers going there. And so there's a debate inside each of the separate Mastodon instances about, do we connect up, do we not, and all of that. And that's a power that you can have by deciding not to join Threads and to join Mastodon instead. And the only reason I'm on Threads is because Instagram automatically made me a user account. Blue Sky is another example of this, but like I said, it's a little bit more centralized in that the bsky.app site, like social.bsky.app, is like the primary server for most people, but it is relatively easy to stand up another server, and you can actually change your name if you prove that you own a domain. I think that there's some good things around these things. And Mike Masnick, he's on the board of Blue Sky. He wrote a white paper here about this that they built it on. And I think that Blue Sky and Mastodon and Twitter are important, and if they start changing the way that they censor things, especially around art, which is what built their platforms, artists are going to leave. And I think that that's the value of being federated, is that you can still be on Blue Sky, but you can go to a different server, reach all your other customers, and if they go to a different server, join you on what other server or go to a different one, they can have different rules. Rules around moderation. This allows you to control your data, which ultimately is going to cripple big tech. Big tech lives on data. And this is what Dr. Hill argues for. The excess monopoly value of ads and data and the network effects is all captured by big tech instead of being shared with their advertisers appropriately, with end users, with other customers. That's an extraction and exploitative part of Facebook. I've talked about that in some of my other videos. But because of the whole interop thing, it also drives the behavior of buy and kill or buy and integrate that like Facebook has done with Instagram and WhatsApp and all that, because then they don't have a competitor and they have all the data. If they were forced to compete, or if WhatsApp was able to interop with Facebook or Instagram was able to interop, even though they're different platforms, Facebook would have died a long time ago. I mean, that's why they bought it. So I think if we look at these books together, that there are some interesting ideas where we can say that, yes, centralization allows to exploitation to a certain point, and then you need to have diversification, and you kind of need to have nodes of exploitation while you continue to have other places of innovation. And I think that in the US, you could see that a little bit as innovation hotspots moved around. So like you had the steel in Pittsburgh, and then in the Rust Belt area, and then you had automotive in Detroit, and then you had early compute and systems for the internet in Boston, and now you have Silicon Valley and Silicon Valley, and you can see how these all different, they hopped around, and that as one kind of business grew and reached kind of its pinnacle and started to peter out, the country or the region as a whole was able to successfully move into different aspects of roles. And Frey argued the same thing happened in Europe, where intellectuals were able to move between country to country and able to do that relatively easily, the way that I've been able to move from state to state within the U.S. The big problem is now we got to figure out how to break up big tech so that we can have something else come be the next thing, because AI isn't it. It's a bubble. It's going to crash. And I think we need to use the lessons of, hey, centralize, decentralize, centralize, encourage decentralization, encourage multiple winners, encourage multiple attempts, because then you'll have multiple chances at winning. So, like I said, I think we need to break up big tech. We need to force different incentives for venture capital and private equity. I think we need to break up private equity as well. Venture capital was a big reason for this massive growth in these blitz growth strategy. And I think it will continue to lead to more big companies like this. Anyway, what do you think? Do you think that the industrial revolutions are the key to growth? Do you think that you want to check out either of these books? Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you have any recommendations or thoughts on books that you want me to read next, let me know. I'm always looking for suggestions. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a good one.